All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Valentine's Day, and welcome to our 3 o'clock briefing today. Food waste drives global problems. Our two speakers today are Sheril Kirshenbaum, co-director of the Food Literacy and Engagement Poll at Michigan State University, and Michael Weber, professor of mechanical engineering at University of Texas at Austin. We will get started with our briefing, which will run through 3:45 p.m., after which, if there are additional questions, you can connect with our speakers privately. Without further ado, Sheril.
Thank you so much, and let me tell everyone in the room, there's no one I'd rather be spending my Valentine's Day with than all of you.
Why? A skeptical audience already, I think, yeah.
Oh dear. Well, I'll just make a few comments and then Michael will, and we can have more of a conversation after that. As all of you know, because you chose to come to this session, food shapes our lives. On a personal level, what we eat impacts our health and nutrition. But our choices and agricultural practices set the course for the collective future in terms of how we produce food, what's available, for who, and its impact on the environment. Here's the thing, though. Most of us, the vast majority of Americans, are misinformed and disengaged when it comes to what we eat. In 2017, Michigan State University launched the biannual Food Literacy and Engagement Poll. Every 6 months, we survey over 2,000 Americans, age 18 and over, representative of the whole country based on census demographics, and we ask them questions about their attitudes related to a variety of food topics, from genetically modified foods to food labels. And the results are often surprising. For example, more than a third, 37% of Americans, do not know that non-genetically modified food contains genes. I suspect that most of us who come here to the AAAS conference probably do know that, but if you look around, we're not exactly representative of the nation as a whole, and that means many of the big ideas we're hearing about over these few days often don't make their way out into the broader public discourse. This January, we took a closer look at public awareness and attitudes related to food waste. Food waste accounts for 1/3 of all food produced for human consumption and takes up over a quarter, 28%, of the world's agricultural lands. It costs an estimated $218 billion every year in the US, and that all adds up to about $1,800 on average per household of 4. Also, at a time when we're looking to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the face of climate change, food waste generates enough methane to rank number 3 if it were its own country, behind the US and China. I know. So I'm here to report some encouraging news. We need more of that. 88% of Americans say they try to reduce food waste at home. And now, of course, self-reporting isn't necessarily accurate when it comes to our behavior, but for any of you that do follow polling, it's quite high. As an example, National Science Foundation a few years ago reported that 76% of Americans correctly answered the question that the Earth revolves around the sun. So 88% is very high, and that's good news. Among that group, 71% try not to purchase excess food. 71% also say they often consume food before it spoils, and 34% share their excess food whenever. A few other notable highlights. We can break down our data by various different demographics, and we did notice significant differences by age in terms of attitudes and awareness of food waste. For example, 94% of Americans age 55 and over say they're reducing their food waste at home, compared to 81% of those under 30. We were also curious about attitudes related to the adoption of emerging technologies that can provide new opportunities to tackle our food waste challenge. 41% of Americans are willing to buy a GMO-derived fruit or vegetable that stays fresh longer than what's currently available. Each wave of our survey includes one food literacy question, and this time we chose to ask about what percentage of food annually produced in the US gets wasted. 40% of respondents chose the correct range, which is 31 to 50%, and that includes 44% of those age 55 and over, and 36% of those under 30. And I get it, I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you, and that's because this is a really rich data set. And I haven't begun to touch on differences between income, education, region, and more. But the overall take-home message is an optimistic one. Americans are aware of our food waste challenge, and they seem to be taking steps to reduce their food print. Thanks.
Thanks, Sheril. Good to see all of you today. I've got a little bit of a cough and a cough drop, so my apologies if I speak in an unintelligible way. And I'm also jet lagged, so if I'm incoherent, it's the sleep deprivation, not lack of intent to be precise with my language. I'll share a couple thoughts with you about food and energy in particular, just building on some of the things Sheril said. And primarily the point is that food is more energy, land, and water intensive than most people realize. And consequently, the environmental impacts are quite significant for the food system. If I look just at energy, which is my area of specialty, the numbers are quite significant in the United States in particular, where we have access to better data. At least 8% and possibly as much as 16% of national energy consumption over the course of the years for the food system in the United States. The latest numbers that we can deduce are probably about 12.5% of national energy consumption is in food. That's a very big number. That's bigger than lighting. That's bigger than a lot of other sectors that you might care about. The amount of energy in the U.S. food system is more energy than the United Kingdom consumes for all purposes in the course of the year. So think about that. We have more energy in the U.S. food system than the United Kingdom has for all purposes, just to give it a sense of scale. A large country with a large food system and with many people, so we have big energy consumption there. Simultaneously, as Sheril said, food waste is quite high. At least 25%, perhaps as much as 40% of edible food is wasted. That's edible food is wasted, not the non-edible food. So 40% or so of edible food is wasted. That means that a significant fraction of energy is embedded in the food we throw away, the edible food we throw away. At least 2% of national energy consumption, perhaps as high as 4% or so of national energy consumption is embedded in the edible food we throw away. That's more energy than Switzerland or Sweden consume in a year. So the amount of energy embedded in the food we throw away could power entire countries if there were a way to harness it or avoid it. So that means food waste is an obvious place to start if you wish to reduce the energy intensity or the environmental impacts of the food system. Thankfully, there are solutions, as Sheril said, and there's reasons for some optimism. Perhaps we can change our culture around serving sizes in the United States, and maybe we say that for the whole developing world, although the United States serving sizes are bigger than most of Europe, say in Australia. We could change our culture around leftovers. Some people just don't eat leftovers for whatever reason, and I think that's an opportunity to reduce food waste. We could change our culture around all-you-can-eat buffets, which I think is an American concept and cultural contribution to the world. You're welcome. And we could also consider new technical approaches. I want to spend a little more time on this. One technical approach is to expand what we call the cold chain, the refrigerated or frozen supply chain parts of the food system. Or we could reconsider the nuances around the technology of meal kit delivery. So I'll talk about the cold chain and meal kit delivery a little bit more. The cold chain is quite energy intensive, and ironically, the idea of it spending more energy in the cold chain actually could save energy because the cold chain helps preserve food and avoid food loss or spoilage. And so non-obviously, spending more energy in the cold chain could avoid food waste and therefore save energy in a complicated way. There's a trade-off that if we do it the right way, might yield some benefit. That's something we're looking at now. Results aren't done. And with the meal kit delivery system, that requires more energy for packaging and delivery, but might save food waste or save other trips to the grocery store and might save energy as well. So these are two nuanced categories. Let me expand on a little bit. By one estimate I mentioned to you, the food system requires about 12.5% of national U.S. energy consumption. That's 12.5 quadrillion BTU of energy for 1 quad of food energy. So let me put these numbers in perspective. In the United States, over the course of a year, we consume 100 quadrillion BTU, British thermal units, of energy for all purposes, power plants, cars, you name it. 12.5 quads of that 100 is for the food system. Of that 12.5 quads, 1 quad is in the food we ingest. So for 325 million Americans, we need 1 quadrillion BTU of energy in the food we ingest just to keep those people alive. Scale that up around the world, and you can figure out we need like 20 to 25 quadrillion BTU of food energy just to feed the world's billions of people. But the food system needs more than that to preserve it, chop it, grow it, move it, harvest it, that kind of thing. And it works out to be a ratio of about 10 to 1 or even more, 10, maybe 12 to 1. The amount of energy we spend on food is 10 times or more the amount of energy in the food, if that makes sense, for all the systems are at it. A big part of that, about 40% of that 12.5 quads, or 40% of that 12.5%, is in the cold chain, refrigerators and freezers, refrigerated trucks, that kind of thing. And some of that is for food processing, to pre-chill fruits before you chop them, that kind of thing. Some of it, a half a quad or so, is for refrigerated trucking, the trucks that move things in a cool way. A little bit for grocery stores or warehouses, not that much really. A half a quad or so for car trips to go get refrigerated foods, a quad of quadrillion BTU of energy at the restaurants, their freezers and refrigerators, and 2 quads, or 2% of national energy consumption, is just in the refrigerators and freezers in our homes. Again, that's one Switzerland's worth of energy is just in U.S. home-based refrigerators and freezers, not even including those at warehouses and elsewhere. So the cold chain ends up being a non-trivial amount of energy across the nation and is an opportunity for improving the opportunity to reduce food waste. And that's because in the United States and other developed parts of the world, our food waste is usually at the plate or at the end of the supply chain. We have pretty good silos and storage and pest control, so we don't have much food waste on the farm, there's some. We don't have much food waste in the silos or the warehouses or the trucks. The distribution tends to be at our houses. And so tightening up that supply chain improves it further, and changing their behaviors at the end will help. But if you look around the world, a lot of the food waste is on the farm because their supply chains aren't quite as tight. Poor people don't throw away leftovers, they eat them. And so in poor countries, the food waste is not at the plate, it's elsewhere in the supply chain. Improving the cold chain opens up the ability to tighten that up and have less spoilage. And so we're starting to look at that. This is an opportunity, not obviously, to spend more energy on the cold chain to save energy on the food loss and waste. So that's one idea to keep in mind. That research is in process, not published yet, unfortunately. The second idea is meal kit delivery. I know I'm going long. Meal kit delivery is a business that's worth more than $5 billion a year in the United States, and it's a business that didn't even really exist before 2012. This is pretty interesting because if you have finely tuned meal kits with the portion size for a meal, food waste goes down a lot because we tend to overshop. And with meal kit delivery, it's more precise with the portion, so food waste goes down a lot. That saves a lot of energy. However, you now have trucks instead of cars delivering the food. That drives your energy up, and then you have all the packaging. There's a lot of energy in that packaging as well. And what we concluded with our research, which is in review right now, is that if you only use your packaging once for meal kit delivery, it expands the amount of energy we use for the food system. But if you can reuse your packaging, if it's glass or hard plastics or things that you can sterilize, wash, and use again, it saves energy. Despite the additional diesel truck trips for the meal kit delivery, there's enough food loss and waste avoided and energy from that food avoided, you get a net savings. And by the way, that diesel truck presumably isn't delivering just for you, but delivering for dozens of your neighbors. And so there are some efficiencies you can get from that if you can reuse the packaging. If you're using a bunch of one-time use cardboard and paper, then it's a real problem. It drives up your energy use. And so if you go back to reusable glass, like the old days with milk delivery, which we used to have when I was a kid in the 1970s in the United States, then you can get some energy savings, which I think is interesting. If those meal kit deliveries happen frequently enough that it gets you to reduce your trips to the grocery store, your car trips on gasoline, displaced by truck trips on diesel to deliver your meal kit, and then if the truck trips are on electric cars, even better maybe. But if you reduce your gasoline-powered car trips to the grocery store because of meal kit delivery, then the energy savings are actually pretty significant. Because a lot of our rhythm of shopping is driven by the perishable foods that spoil. When we go to get toilet paper or paper towels, we might do that every 6 weeks because they don't spoil, but the low shelf life items we tend to get every few days, maybe a couple times a week. But if the perishable foods are brought to us, we reduce those car trips to only go when we need those non-perishable items, there's a lot of savings from the avoided car trips. And the cars are more efficient, but they carry one family. The truck might deliver for 100 families, that kind of thing. So there's a bunch of non-obvious trade-offs in this research, but we're finding that meal kit delivery is nuanced, and how you do it matters a lot, but it could be a path to big food waste avoidance and therefore energy savings, and that tightening up the cold chain could also have some improvements. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Great, that makes me hungry. Okay, now we'll open up the floor to questions. Please raise your hand. We'll bring a mic to you and kindly state your name and affiliation. So we'll start here and then we'll come over here. Thanks.
We have two big problems in Australia, and I just want to see whether you've got the same thing. Australians are terribly worried about straight bananas, and so the supermarkets sort out. Ones that are straight, ones that are winkle, apples that have got a nano spot on them, and all of these are eliminated at source on a gigantic scale. Imagine the appellations, bananas, apples, things like that. That's one problem. Another thing that really scares them is the use-by date. And sometimes I use milk that's a week old, past the use-by date.
You're a brave man.
And the record is 2 weeks. And it smells perfectly fine, but people run screaming and hide under their desks similar problems, and is there room to move in both of those examples?
All sorts of comments, but you want to go first and then I'll.
Short answer, yes. With a few exceptions. I mean, there are products where those use-by dates matter, but they're pretty arbitrary for the most part. Sell-by, use-by, best-by, and I think they do result in a tremendous amount of food waste, unfortunately. A lot of it's just because consumers want it, and you'll find that with all sorts of aspects of labels. There's all sorts of information on labels we don't need or even don't mean anything. That was so the numbers I was reading you today. We're releasing those numbers today. It's the fourth wave of the poll. But our last wave focused specifically on attitudes related to food labels and what people are looking for. And they're looking for things like clean and natural, which frankly don't mean anything. And they're really focused on the best by, use by, sell by dates as well. And I think for many things, that's why they're there. And of course, for prescriptions and certain extremely perishable items, they do matter. With regard, I think you're talking about like ugly produce. There have been small movements here to encourage people to eat ugly vegetables and ugly fruits, and sometimes supermarkets have specific bins where people can shop and pay less and get those ugly, blemished vegetables. They are perfectly fine. Actually, Doug Bueller, who's in the audience, who will be our moderator tomorrow, might have some more expertise on this.
What's ugly about straight banana?
I don't know. But
A lot of people like to use it as a phone, so it doesn't work if it's.
I'll let you.
I think these are great comments. And I think the comments about ugly fruits and vegetables is purely a phenomenon of the rich world. In the poor world, you don't have that luxury. And in the rich world, we can be picky and choosy, and so a lot of the vegetables and fruits are grown for their look rather than their flavor. So anecdotally, people complain to me that tomatoes in the U.S. do not taste as good today as 40 years ago, but they look better. They're a deeper red, or they're better shape, that kind of thing. And so that's an issue. I think for the factory kitchens, the ones that make canned goods, they don't care. They can still use it. So it's really a consumer attitude or cultural thing at the end. I'm on the board of a nonprofit called Sustainable America that looks to reduce food waste and the energy requirements for food. And we help push an I Value Food campaign and an Eat Ugly Fruit campaign, that kind of thing. So there are some cultural efforts to try to change our attitudes about it, but cultural changes take a generation or two. They tend to be very sticky if you do get them, but they're very slow. And so we have that same problem, and it's an issue, and we just have to get used to it. And maybe we can get there with pricing mechanisms, that kind of thing. A lot of the ugly fruits and vegetables are not even presented to us as consumers as an option. The grocery stores get rid of them before they're put out on the floor. So that's an issue. Straight bananas might be an issue. Some people want straight bananas because you might want to make diced bananas for puddings or something like that, and that'd be easier to process. There's a famous story, which I don't know is true, so you should fact check it, not believe me, that McDonald's tried to grow rectangular potatoes for many years because that'd be easier to chop into French fries. So the idea of modifying the fruits and vegetables to be more convenient or more familiar to our tastes is not new. And I think this is a real opportunity to reduce food waste. That's purely a cultural issue, changing our cultural habits around that. And this is in contrast with Great Depression era or World War II era or earlier attitudes about you clean your plate and that there's no food to waste, this kind of thing. We've lost that attachment to the difficulty of growing food. Food's so cheap and abundant, it's easy to waste it for cosmetic reasons. The labeling issue is very complex. As Sheril mentioned, there are many different types of wordings on labels, and we in America and around the world don't really know what the labels mean. Is it a safety concern? Is it a quality concern? Is it best used by a certain date? Or your health is at risk if you don't use it by a certain date? The wordings have not been consistent or clear for a long time. And the labels are pretty conservative in general. Which is they're trying to avoid some health issues. If you've ever had spoiled milk or bad fish and paid the price, you might be very conservative about that and throw the food away, even though the food might be fine well past that date. And by the way, the food might be spoiled well before that date. And that's the challenge. The date system is a very clunky, heavy-handed approach to managing it. And I think there's room for technology there, by the way, I'd say, because food, well managed in a freezer, can last for years, well past the date, because it was frozen and maintained at the right temperature. And so I imagine it might be better for me as an engineer thinking about this, not as a behaviorist, that if we had labels that were temperature sensitive, that would change color and tell you, I've been exposed to the wrong temperature for the wrong time, I might not be good anymore. That'd be more useful than the clunky date, for example. But if the label has been kept at the proper temperature, for its entire lifetime, then you would know it's still good. So there might be other ways we can signal to the consumer that there's something better. We could also directly measure spoilage. Date is one way to estimate the spoilage, but it's not actually a measure of spoilage. But you can measure spoilage of fruits and vegetables because when they spoil, they put off ethylene gas. Let me ask you, some of you probably heard the phrase that every barrel has a rotten apple. Have you ever heard this phrase? Which actually isn't the phrase. The phrase is just one apple will quickly make the whole barrel rotten. Because when an apple spoils or ripens, it puts off ethylene gas, and ethylene gas triggers the ripening effect. So one spoiled thing will then spoil the others. But what if you had a way to measure the gases given off when spoilage happens, and then maybe to filter it out so it doesn't trigger more spoilage? You could directly measure spoilage. If we don't do that, we estimate it with dates. So maybe there's an opportunity for new sensors, nano sensors, quantum sensors, I don't know. There are other things that could track this more directly. They'd be more useful. The labels are clunky, and they invite a conservatism like, well, I guess I'll throw it away. I don't want to get sick. And that can be very costly from a waste perspective.
And I'll just add to that finally, there are entire markets whose names shall not be said that are notorious for throwing out all sorts of produce well before the sell-by date, produce, milks, eggs. Within a certain number of days, it has to be gone, even though the date is like 3-4 days in the future. So we lose a lot of food that way as well. I assume it's to please a customer base.
I would say I live in France right now, which is its own story about food, which I can talk about later. But in France, they don't do that. There's less food waste in Europe than America, although I would say Europeans are not that far behind the United States. There's still a lot of food waste in the UK and continental Europe. But in France, they don't care if you buy food that's spoiled. That's your problem. You should have read the label. And in the United States, they'll put the closest expiration items in the front and the newest items in the back. And so Americans who care might push the milk aside and grab one from the back because it has an expiration date further in the future. Some of you are nodding as if you've done that as well. In France, they don't do that, and it's up to you. So there's different attitudes around this. So the throwing it away because it might expire in 4 days strikes me as probably an American phenomenon. I don't know, to please someone so that they don't feel like they're getting ripped off paying so much for food that might spoil soon, even though the food actually might not spoil at that date.
Question over here? Yeah.
Hi, Sid Perkins. I'm a freelance writer. Wanted to talk with you, Dr. Kirshenbaum, about some of the data. And you talked about how people are increasingly concerned and presumably addressing trying to minimize the amount of food waste that they generate. Does your data, does the questions in your survey allow you to discriminate whether they're worried about carbon footprint, whether they're worried about their bottom line and saving money overall? Is it a combination of both, or is it purely kind of, self, bottom line as opposed to kind of a global sense of being a good, a citizen?
That's a great question, and in particular, because it allows me to tell you more about our poll. Yes, we do try to get it. So we had this initial question of, are you taking steps to reduce food waste at home, where we saw the 88%. We ask people why they're concerned about it, which is where I was getting some of those numbers about actions that they take to share food when possible or not purchase as much excess food. But we ask people why they're not, the 12% that aren't included, why weren't they trying to take steps to reduce food waste at home? I don't remember all the numbers off the top of my head, but I do know that in that smaller 12%, 31% of those people, when asked the same question in a different way, said, I don't waste food at home. So that takes about a third of the folks who aren't doing it out. And then we saw some other responses like, I don't have time. Students were the group that was least likely to say they have time to be thinking about food waste. We have people who said they're simply not familiar with the term food waste or that they don't know how to take steps to reduce the food waste at their house. But we do try to get some of those more nuanced answers from our data, and then we see some pretty interesting differences between income, level of education. A lot of these things correlate together, but we do see some pretty significant differences based on the demographic information we have in terms of how they're responding.
Question in the back there. The mic is coming to you. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Bradley Haig. I'm also a freelance writer. I was wondering if you could differentiate, or if the science is differentiated, between the end user states. How much is literally at the individual consumer on the plate into the trash level, and how much is at the grocery store at the warehouse at the, oh, this looks ugly, throw it away level of food wastage. Do you have that fine grain of a detail, and if so, what is it?
That's a great question. I have some of that information for the United States, and I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but can get you some finer estimates. And if we think of, say, 40% of food, edible food, is wasted in the United States, which is a reasonable number given the latest research, something like 12 to 15%, I'm going by memory, is at the farm. Another 12% or so is along the system, say the warehouses, the food processing facilities, and the restaurants. So it's retail, commercial, wholesale, that kind of thing. And then the rest is at our homes. So a pretty significant fraction is at our homes and scraping it into the trash can, that kind of thing. And I mean, I see it in my house, and we're sensitive to this. And the amount of waste is, I can't remember the number, a pound of food per household per day or something like that. And this is, you might have that old jar of pickles or something like that. You might have these kind of foods that you just haven't eaten and get thrown away. So it feels very much like an end of the supply chain problem in the United States. We do have some waste on the farms, but for the most part, the farms don't want to waste it. They want to sell it. So their financial interest is in reducing waste, and that's true along the way. The numbers are tilted to the earlier part, closer to the farm for the developing world, where a small farmer, subsistence farmer, might have their multiple sacks or barrels or whatever it is of grains that they store in their house. And it's not a silo, it's not airtight, it's not sealed, as they often have spoilage from the heat, or more importantly, infestation from bugs and that kind of thing. So we don't have the infestation problems in the developed world the way the developing world farmers do. They don't have the access to the chemicals, the pesticides, or the storage facilities. And so their problem, and then by the time the food gets to the plate, they're often poor, they're gonna eat it. So it's tilted where it is in the supply chain. And I think that's important to keep in mind because the solutions might be different. There's a group out of Switzerland called Vestergaard making these fly-safe sacks, where it's a sack for storing grains that you can hermetically seal so it's airtight, so that whatever bugs get in die because there's not oxygen. They die before they reproduce. So maybe there's some bugs in the food, but they don't reproduce, so they don't spoil the whole thing. And the outside of the sack is coated in a pesticide, so the bugs die before they get into the sack in the first place. So that's a passive technology approach to dealing with the infestation or ruining of the crop that, closer to the field. So a lot of the consumer waste is really a rich world phenomenon.
If young people want to get involved in thinking about the food waste problem, are there certain fields where you would recommend that they engage? Like, is it engineering? Is it getting out there and polling the community to get better data? Or what would you say to that?
I'm sure we both have something to say. I'd say it's a really interdisciplinary problem, so it's a good question, but I think that there's a place for many different kinds of experts in this area. So of course, there's the engineering side, there's all sorts of the food research, which we do a lot of at MSU, but then there's also this really important communication piece, because I think that there's a lack of understanding and a lack of appreciation for all the food that gets wasted and then its more dramatic impact in other realms. Like we've been hearing so much, for example, in policy circles now about climate change as a challenge, but I don't think many people realize we're looking for solutions to climate change by inventing our way out of this, some kind of new innovation, when in reality, if we were able to effectively reduce the amount of food we waste, we would tremendously cut carbon emissions. And I think like putting all of that together involves a heck of a lot of communication around the issue. And I just want to add too, because you mentioned the data. Data collection is great. There's always more space for this too. That gets into marketing and other places. But for anyone who's interested in looking more at our data from the Food Literacy and Engagement Poll, all the top line results are online at food.msu.edu. And we're willing to share all sorts of demographic information if you just email me, Sheril at msu.edu afterwards as well.
I think it's a great question. As Sheril said, it's really multidisciplinary. Food is where science and policy and engineering and economics and behavioral choices come together. Well, you can even add in religion and many other traditions of life. So food cuts across all sectors, and therefore everyone has a role to play in being part of the solution, and there's a lot at stake. I'm an engineer, so I often default towards technical solutions, but I think actually our food issues are more cultural, and therefore there's room for artists and musicians and people who shape the way we think to get really engaged through information campaigns and communication efforts, that kind of thing. And there are some, these I Value Food campaigns or these Eat Ugly Fruit campaigns. There's even Twitter feeds just show pictures of ugly fruit every day and how it's still edible. So there are things we can do that are clever that don't require any new device or widget, but just a new mindset. And I think that's where there's a lot of room to make in the United States and other rich parts of the world. To get to the developing world, and it might be more of a business investment policy. There might be a different requirement there. It's actually investing in the supply chain or investing in training people to use different methods, not a behavioral issue. But I think in the U.S., we need a lot of communicators and thinkers and cultural influencers.
All right. Well, if we don't have any other questions, thank you very much to our speakers. That was fascinating. We really appreciate it. Okay.